For all the videos I've done about historical events and characters, I haven't really devoted much attention to history itself. Today we're going to get into that a little bit with a discussion of the nature of bias in history and why an awareness of historical point of view matters so much. Let's start with bias. Most people will agree that we should all strive to have as much of an unbiased account of history as possible, because that's the most accurate perspective, and I'd say that this is fair. There is, however, a teeny tiny problem here, which is that bias is fundamentally impossible to eliminate from any historical account. Slightly complicating my attempts to discuss bias and how it can be managed, there are about a billion different types of bias to consider. But for simplicity's sake and for the purposes of this discussion here, I'm cutting that billion down to about 4. First off, source bias. When we're looking at historical accounts, we need to ask what our sources are and who we can even trust in the first place. This is a little tricky with my specific brand of history since I'm focused on older periods in time when good sources are rather hard to come by. But in general, when we're looking at any given time and place in history, we're usually piecing together a composite image from a mix of sources, usually coming from different parties that might have different agendas, which might lead to some facts being twisted in certain ways to suit those agendas. I've been told when looking at a source to always ask cui bono, who benefits? For instance, who benefits when Thucydides tells about a battle that he himself lost against a certain Spartan general named Brasidas, and makes a point to talk about how great of a guy he is and how skilled of a general he is? Well, if you ask me, Thucydides sure would like to paint himself as having been defeated by only the finest Spartan general that Sparta ever had. Here's another one. Who benefits when Caesar recalls an interaction with a German king who says, "Oh yes, there are tons of Romans who I'm friends with who want you dead, Caesar." It would definitely seem to me like Caesar is trying to associate his political enemies in Rome with the Germans. So, can we say that Brasidas really was an excellent general, or that the German king really did say that? Well, you tell me. Those are the only sources that we have on the matter, so we don't have a choice but to simply take them as sources if we want any insight into the events they describe. But, we have to do it with a grain of salt. Then, in the cases where we actually do have multiple sources for a specific event, who do we trust more? Are we more liable to trust the quote-unquote winners or the losers in a given event? If we tend to lean more one way than the other, we're actually compounding the source's bias with our own, which just replaces one problem with another. So do we use every source? Do we try to determine which parts are fact and which parts are fiction? Is that still compounding the bias? Is there any way to scrub our brains clean and actually write something that isn't biased? So imagine that it so happens that we have good sources that more or less agree and leave us with a nice web of facts and events to work with. Now, let me be clear, it never so happens that we have perfect sources, ever, but for the sake of this argument, let's go with it. That leaves us with a lot of facts to sift through, and if we're taking anything less than literal years to recount a history, we have to make some choices about what we do and don't include. Which details matter? Which details don't? Do any details matter? What characters do we focus on? How many days, years, or centuries of material are we covering? All of these considerations determine how we use what we have. Even if we assume for convenience that we're working with indisputable facts, which we most certainly are not, what information we choose to include in our story makes a huge impact on what kind of story we're telling and what our bias is. If we're telling American history, for instance, and we talk about what a great guy Washington was for refusing power and advocating for a balanced government, that reflects very positively on him. But if we instead make a point to discuss the hypocrisy of slave ownership among the Founding Fathers, we are portraying them much more negatively. The choices we make with regards to what we discuss can make a big difference in how our history comes across. Now, we can absolutely tell a story that recognizes Washington's reservations about power but still calls him out for owning slaves, and that's automatically a less biased and overall better constructed history because it shows different sides to the story, which is good. But there are still smaller things that we aren't controlling for, and those little biases will stick around no matter how hard we try. Less of a problem? Yes, but still biased. Another important bias to keep in mind is the inherent bias of a listener. If we think that our audience may have moral convictions about an event or be interested in certain aspects of a given history, and we want them to enjoy the history that we're telling, we can cater to that by showing more of what we think they want to see. That's why I try to incorporate silly jokes and stories from history when I can. They're fun, and most viewers enjoy fun. But also in a way, I'm deliberately distorting the content of my history to make it more palatable for a viewer. Is that harmless because it's all for the sake of comedy and your enjoyment, or am I committing a serious historian's crime? There are arguments for either side, although you're probably not surprised to learn that I'm biased towards the former. I'm also biased towards cringy puns, so Take that as you will. Conversely, sometimes I can recognize that viewers will tend towards a certain bias or stereotype on a topic, so I go out of my way to showcase aspects that deliberately break that mold in order to portray the history as more fleshed out than just the stereotype. I made a point to do this in my histories of Judaism and Islam, since those religions specifically are often so misunderstood and viewed negatively in certain respects. I tried to tell a history that highlighted more positive and less well understood elements of Jewish and Muslim history. Again, am I providing viewers with a broader base for their knowledge and asking them to challenge their preconceived notions? Or am I a globalist snowflake cuck? That is up to you to decide. So can we construct history in a way that's totally free from bias? Hell no. God, no, not a chance, not in a billion years. But that doesn't mean we should spend all day lying about who shot first and who's to blame for the fall of Rome. I recognize that historical bias is a problem that we can't really solve, but we can try, and there are two easy things that everyone can do to help make dealing with bias easier. First, if we try our honest best to not deliberately misrepresent anything, we're pretty much in the clear. It gives us a chance to discuss and improve our perspectives, to get a lot of different sides, to make informed decisions about what we choose to ascribe to, and most importantly, to grow. If we all had PhDs, then the standard is obviously higher than just that, but for us, for you and me, it works. Second, in order to minimize the transfer of bias from writer to reader, it helps if we start by conveying our own known biases to our readers. I'm a Hellenist. I like Greece. I think Greece is cool. I am naturally predisposed to talking about Greece being cool. This bias is pretty obvious if you've seen my videos, but it's also relatively harmless. A more contentious bias I have is that Judaism and Islam are positive forces in the world. A lot of people will disagree, and have disagreed with me on that. But I made a point to explain in my video on those topics that I was openly trying to show why these cultures are good and valuable things. I led with that bias in part so that people would understand that I wasn't necessarily going to be reinforcing their own conceptions, because I was working from a perspective that was, by necessity, not universal. And that's important, because if anyone thinks that their own perspective is universal and treats it that way, we inevitably get really nasty disagreements where everyone thinks that they have the only right and universal answer, which, for several reasons, is impossible. Essentially, it's important to try and limit needless bias as much as we possibly can, but there are places where we either can't avoid bias or are using our own biases to make a persuasive argument to explicitly try and convince people of the validity of certain perspectives, as I sometimes do with my videos on this channel. What matters is that we're always clear with each other about what our intentions are and where we're coming from so that no one is misled. Okay, now that I've said bias so much that the word probably loses all meaning, let's move on and talk about how historical point of view conveys its own type of bias. 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 Nope, it's gone. Now, point of view is something that most people might not consider in history. We usually think about point of view as denoting whether a book takes the perspective of the protagonist or an outside observer who, admittedly, happens to know the protagonist's thoughts at all times, but in history, point of view is inherent as well as problematic. Now, before we get to that, I should say that I'm very much of the opinion that peoples, nations, and empires all have specific characters. Depending on how specific we go, there are certain trends that we can observe. Greeks, in general, at the point of history that I typically examine, all act in similar ways, they speak the same language, they have similar values, and they all fight in the same way. But Spartans and Athenians would think that they're totally different from each other, and they can justifiably say that because Sparta and Athens both have unique characteristics that differentiate them. Sparta is a very martial, measured, and orderly place, whereas Athens is more philosophical, acquisitive, and excitingly chaotic. We can distinguish between certain Athenians, but we can agree that Athens itself also has its own unique character to it. The Greek historian Thucydides believed that states have character, and so will I. So earlier we were saying that history always has a point of view. What I mean by this is that whether we're focusing on events that pertain to Athens or Greece as a whole, we're generally following one or two key quote-unquote characters here. If we're talking about Athenian history, we may end up jumping to a Greek point of view during, say, the Persian Wars, but we're still following Athens' point of view by way of Greece for that interlude. Side note, the fact that we call it the Persian Wars instead of the Greco-Persian Wars reveals a bias just by itself. If I then tell Roman history, I'm telling a history from the point of view of the Romans, that is, what Rome did and what happens to Rome. Yeah, we can talk about other factors and other factions, but everything discussed is discussed insofar as it relates back to Rome. Hopefully this should all seem fairly mundane. Actually, really, I'm just adhering to the principles of telling a good story. Stories have arcs, and we follow characters to see what happens to them along those arcs. Stories have beginnings, middles, and ends. If I tell you every single thing that happened in the entire world in the year 400 BC, that would be a pretty terrible history because it has no point of view. I'm not giving a history at that point, I'm just listing facts. History has to be a story, it's in the word itself. History is always a narrative. I'll say right off that history textbooks are some of the most boring things in the world, but even they maintain point of view. Here's the thing with point of view and how it relates back to bias. Almost every psychologist on Earth will say that seeing something from someone's particular perspective makes an observer inherently sympathetic to that protagonist because they start to identify with them. This is why point of view becomes important. I've talked on this channel about the Fourth Crusade on more than a few occasions. For those of you who don't recall, this is the one where Venice basically sacks the crap out of Constantinople on basically a grudge that they had from a few years back. When I tell this story in the middle of my Venetian history series, I present it as admittedly a really crappy and shameful moment in their history, but then I go on to follow Venetian history and you, the viewer, see how much Venice benefited from this, so that atrocity gets subconsciously excused because of the point of view I'm presenting. When I think about the Fourth Crusade from the Byzantine perspective, though, I feel like total crap. Here was an empire that had gone strong for almost 1,000 years at this point, only to be dealt a blow that it never recovered from, and that ultimately doomed it because of a Venetian grudge. A tiny little grudge that led to all of this. Go 200 years later and look at what happens. Whether we say it's the conquest of Constantinople or the fall of Constantinople says a lot about whose perspective we're following. To the point of view of the Byzantine historian, Constantinople as a concept died in 1453 when it fell to the Ottomans. But to the Ottoman historian, the conquest of Constantinople was the entry point to several centuries of amazing and wonderful history, and it marked a transformation of the city into something totally new and exciting. So what happened in 1453? Did Constantinople fall, or did the Ottomans conquer it? That depends on whose story you're telling, and that's a bias that we can't possibly shake, no matter how much we account for the stuff I've spent the past 15 minutes describing. Because we're telling a story, and the story is totally different depending on which side is the point of view character. And if you don't believe me, just imagine what Harry Potter is like from the perspective of literally any other major character. From Snape to Dumbledore to Mad-Eye Moody to Ron, it doesn't matter. Who you are following changes things. The perspective that we follow directly affects how we tell a story and how certain characters and events are portrayed in that story. And if we're to be good historians, we have to recognize that inherent bias in our own work as well as in the work of others. To bring all these ideas together, we basically can never construct a history that's totally without bias, or even slightly without bias. We often have either a small amount of sources that reflect their own biases or conflicting sources that we have to choose between. Then we need to decide which facts we present, and if and how we'll tailor those facts to either suit or challenge our audience. Even with all of that, we have to deal with the inherent sympathy that we as viewers and readers and an audience feel for the character whose point of view we follow. The only things we can do are to try and be honest about the material we're handling, as well as our moral or thematic intent in presenting a history. So whether you're listening, reading, or writing history, pay attention to whom you're feeling sympathetic or unsympathetic towards and think about why. We can't avoid bias. No one can. It is completely impossible. But if we try hard and try to be honest with each other, we can sure as heck manage it.